In 1898, tens of thousands marched into the Yukon chasing gold. By winter, some froze beside empty pans. In 1942, a snowbank revealed a buried cabin. Inside, 2 tin cups, a stove, and a ledger with one unfinished line. Dug 3 feet. Charlie said it stopped mid-sentence. What else was swallowed by ice? A frozen cup, a ledger unfinished, a name erased. Between 1896 and 1899, the Klondike Rush brought fortune to a few and ruin to thousands. When gold glittered, what else vanished into snow? What they were chasing wasn't just gold. It was the idea that a single nugget might reset the rest of their lives. Between 1896 and 1899, over 100,000 people turned north, up trails carved in ice, over peaks soaked in frozen blood, through rivers that didn't ask who drowned in them. They brought trunks filled with books and brocade, violins, velvet jackets, china cups, wedding dresses wrapped in tissue, as if the wilderness might applaud refinement. But gold is a terrible host. This is not a story of adventure. It's a story of what they left behind. A stove with no fire, a ledger that ends mid-sentence, a town built from frost and swallowed back by it. They found the cabin in 1942, half buried in snowdrift near Lake Bennett. The roof had folded in on itself, boards cracked from years of pressure, and the door, barely recognizable, sunken into the ice like a lid. Inside, the surveyors expected little more than rotted timber, maybe some rusted nails, a collapsed stove. But they found 2 enamel cups, still standing side by side on a crate, and a ledger, so badly water damaged they thought at first it was blank. It wasn't. Near the back, 1 pencil line remained, written faint and slow. Dug 3 feet. Gold dust faint. Charlie said that was it. The rest of the sentence never came. No last name, no date, no second entry. It's easy to overlook a sentence like that, just another failed attempt in a rush that consumed thousands. But something about it lingers. Maybe it's the interruption, the way the pencil trails off as if the writer had simply looked up and never returned to finish. Maybe it's the thought that someone was trying to record the moment they gave up and didn't get the words out in time. The gold rush had already taken so many by then. It began with the discovery on August 16th, 1896, when George Carmack, Skookum Jim, and Dawson Charlie struck gold on what was then Rabbit Creek. They renamed it Bonanza, and the name was apt. Claims were filed. The word spread south like smoke. And before the rivers even froze that winter, the first wave of stampeders had already begun packing sleds, mortgaging homes, and boarding ships. The journey itself became its own kind of reckoning. The White Pass, later known as Dead Horse Trail, was steep and narrow, twisting through rock and ice. The bodies of thousands of pack animals littered the route, their weight misjudged by men who had never led a team before. The Chilkoot Trail, even more punishing, offered the infamous golden stairs, 1,500 icy steps, carved by hand, climbed repeatedly while ferrying up a literal ton of supplies. Some came with real hope. Others came because they couldn't afford not to. One customs ledger near the summit listed a man's load as 43 pounds flour, 10 pounds salt pork, 1 violin, 1 picture frame, 2 ounces quinine. His name was scrawled too lightly to read. It's unclear if he made it across. At night, the trail quieted. Boots were pulled off in silence. Firewood was shared in small amounts, just enough for tea. Men huddled together, not for company, but for warmth, sometimes refusing to speak for hours at a time because words cost energy, and the silence reminded them they were still here. They wrote less, the farther they climbed, and when they did write, the entries grew smaller, more practical, more immediate. Frosted 2 fingers today. Traded coffee for rope. Think I saw a bear. Not sure even the journals seem to lose hope by inches. That's why the ledger in the cabin matters, not because it's dramatic, but because it feels exactly like someone who reached the end of what they could explain. Charlie said something important enough to be written down, but the page doesn't tell us what it was. Maybe the man set down the pencil to add more wood to the fire. Maybe the wind picked up and the door opened. Maybe Charlie didn't say anything worth remembering after all. Maybe they just sat there, too tired to speak, and someone reached for the ledger out of habit more than conviction. Whatever happened, nothing followed that line. That cabin doesn't appear on maps. The men inside were never identified, and the ledger was never claimed. But something about those 2 cups, still standing, untouched, their enamel chipped but whole, tells us they had not given up the idea of company, even at the edge of the wilderness. They expected someone to drink. That expectation is the last thing they left behind. At the border post along the Chilkoot Trail, Canadian officials didn't ask where you were from, what you were worth, or who you were leaving behind. They asked for weight and proof that you could survive the next year without starving. To cross into the Yukon, each stampeded was required to carry at least 1 ton of supplies. It wasn't an estimate, it was enforced. Flour, bacon, beans, rope, lantern oil, picks, blankets, tea, sugar, boots, tools. The list stretched to 50 items, and each one had to be hauled over the mountains by hand, sled, or pack animal. The weight wasn't negotiable, but what they chose to include beyond that, that's where the story begins. Some packed the bare minimum: salted meat, rough-cut axes, wool rolled tight. Others brought things they couldn't quite justify, but couldn't bring themselves to leave behind. A pocket watch from a father's funeral, a monogrammed dressing gown. One man was seen dragging a collapsible brass bathtub across the pass. Another packed a bird cage, though the bird had long since died. At customs, one record lists 72 pounds bacon, 4 pounds soap, 6 tins of milk, 1 upright mirror, 1 copy of Plutarch. He was never recorded arriving in Dawson. The climb itself demanded repetition. Up the golden stairs, icy steps carved into the side of the mountain. Men would carry 50 to 100 pounds at a time, drop their load at a checkpoint, and return to the bottom to do it again. Some made the round trip dozens of times. Progress was not measured in miles, but in piles, little markers where your possessions waited for your body to return. By the time they reached the summit, many had stopped referring to the items as mine. It was simply the load. The piano was no longer a prized possession, it was an anchor. The case of Bordeaux became dead weight. The heirloom teapot, broken somewhere between slip and fall. The White Pass Trail, known by then as Dead Horse Trail, became a living warning. Over 3,000 horses died along the route, their bodies left to freeze where they collapsed, legs twisted mid-stride, ribs showing through slick, matted fur. Witnesses later said you could smell the trail before you saw it, part sweat, part rot, part resignation. The horses weren't just overburdened, they were misused by men who had never packed a sled in their lives and believed that willingness was the same as experience. At sheep camp, one sled was found overturned in the thaw, with its contents fanned out beneath melting ice. Among them, a velvet jacket, 4 glass perfume bottles, a box of bone-handled forks, and a ledger with the name H. Clemens written on the inside cover. The pages were blank. Not everything they carried was material. Some brought regret. Others carried the silence of debts unpaid, words unsaid, or families left behind without notice. One journal, found in a cave near the summit, its pages stiff with damp, recorded only a single entry before it was abandoned. I thought I was chasing gold, but I think now I am only trying to outrun what I left behind. There were caches, stone-marked piles of goods left behind in hopes of return. Some were recovered, most were forgotten. A violin wrapped in oilcloth was discovered near Crater Lake long after the rush had ended. Its strings had rotted, but the bridge remained. The man who left it there probably never made it back. Or he did, and no longer needed the music. The weight they carried wasn't just physical, it was personal, emotional, and in many cases, misguided. But at the time, none of them believed they were overpacking. They believed they were preparing, and that belief was heavier than any pack. The first shelters were canvas, strung between driftwood and frozen ground. Walls rippled with wind. Fires were built low, more smoke than heat, and beds were made from pine branches laid directly onto snow. But by spring of 1898, Dawson City had transformed, not into comfort, but into performance. What had been a riverbank became a city of facades. Behind the storefronts carved from spruce, you'd still find dirt floors and smoke-stained ceilings, but the windows glittered with hand-lettered signs, and doorways were framed in polished brass. Businesses rose overnight: tailors, tobacconists, apothecaries, gambling halls. all lit by lanterns swaying on hooks forged the week before. Joseph Ledoux, who had claimed the site at the confluence of the Yukon and Klondike rivers, had sold his early plots for $5 or $10. Now, those same lots went for $40,000, paid in gold and promissory notes. Streets were given names, and people clung to them as if names alone could build permanence. At night, Dawson glowed. Oil lamps burned in every window, their flames flickering through panels of imported glass. Inside, mirrored sideboards held decanters half full of warm gin. Upholstered chairs stood in rows at the dance halls, wrapped in burgundy cloth that held the scent of sweat and tobacco. A few pianos made the trip from Vancouver and Seattle, their ivory keys chipped by the cold, but still enough in tune to play a waltz. And yet, even as the city shimmered, the floorboards sagged. Water was hard to get clean. Sanitation lagged. Outhouses overflowed by midwinter, and the smell clung to boots no matter where you stepped. A miner could spend the evening seated in a carved walnut booth, drinking brandy from cut glass, only to sleep in a frostbitten shack built from scavenged crates. Beneath the display, life was crowded and harsh. Over 30,000 people funneled into a town designed for a fraction of that. Tents spilled onto alleys. Soup lines formed before noon. Prices for food and fuel surged. A sack of flour could cost more than a man's daily wage. One woman described Dawson in a letter home as a chandelier town on stilts, pretty from a distance, rotten underneath. The illusion held until it didn't. On April 26, 1899, the fire began. The source still debated. Some say it started in a cook tent. Others insist it was deliberate, meant to clear debt or erase bad credit. What's certain is that it spread faster than anyone expected. Oil, pine, fabric, paper, it all fed the flames. Within hours, 3/4 of Dawson was destroyed. By morning, smoke curled from foundation stones. Streets were unwalkable. Safe boxes had burst open from heat. Bank drawers sat warped, their contents already gone. One ledger page, recovered near the ruins of the Yukon Hotel, was blackened around the edges. Its final line read, "West of Bonanza, no claim filed." Some began rebuilding the next day, not out of hope, but because there was no alternative. Tent frames were hoisted over scorched beams. Canvas stretched over doors that no longer fit their frames. The pianos were never replaced, but the music returned, played now from memory, half forgotten. Today, fragments remain. A bent spoon pulled from a cellar, a melted clasp from a purse no one claimed, frosted window glass, dulled by soot but still whole. These aren't ruins of luxury. They're reminders of how quickly people dressed hardship in the language of permanence. Dawson didn't fall. It burned and rehearsed. Long before the stampeders came, with their tents and maps and coin-heavy plans, the Yukon River was already feeding people. The Trondek Hwechin, the Han people, followed its pulse for generations, fishing for salmon in water clear enough to drink, setting nets between stones worn smooth by time, smoking their catch in sod houses that sat just above the floodline. Then came the gold. By late 1896, as claims were filed up and down Bonanza Creek, a trading post became a town, and the riverbanks began to change. Trees fell. Shorelines collapsed under foot traffic and freight. Sluice water spilled into the current, carrying with it mercury from mining operations, along with sawdust, oil, and waste. The Han were pushed west, relocated to a reserve upriver called Moosehide. Their netting grounds were sold, sectioned, or simply paved over. There was no negotiation, no warning, and in most cases, no written record. But the river kept a different kind of archive. In the 1990s, a collapsed sod house was uncovered at a bend near Bear Creek. Inside, archaeologists found a salmon net knotted with sinew and thread, the net still intact. But what held it down was unexpected. Not river rocks, but British copper coins, pierced and sewn along the bottom edge. Each bore the profile of Queen Victoria, dulled green with corrosion. These coins hadn't arrived by accident. They'd likely been collected one by one and repurposed, turned into ballast for a net now no longer allowed to fish. A different dig near the old Dawson settlement uncovered a tin of tea, traded decades earlier, filled not with leaves, but with hand-forged fishhooks, a comb carved from antler, shards of enamel bowls too delicate to have crossed the trail. These weren't lost objects, they were replacements, signs of adaptation in a system that had pushed their owners to the margins. Meanwhile, upstream, the salmon stopped returning. Between 1898 and 1905, recorded fish populations dropped sharply. Mining runoff choked spawning beds. Dams blocked migration routes. Fires, started by careless travelers, cleared the forests that shaded the streams. Mercury levels rose, not measured at the time, but understood in the way the catch changed. Fish ran smaller, less frequent, or didn't show up at all. The government took no action. One letter from a federal agent in 1901 simply stated that the river's character is shifting, as if erosion and chemical runoff were natural cycles. Another report described the Han community at Moosehide as adjusting slowly, though no one bothered to ask what that meant. And still, the river flowed. It carried away the debris from Dawson's fire. It buried trash piles in layers of frost and silt. It iced over in winter and flooded in spring. But it also held on to things, the traces that official ledgers ignored, the bones of fish, the scent of tannin, the glint of copper beneath moss. A spoon dented at the base, pulled from the riverbed by a child in the 1960s, still smooth, still whole, still here. No monument was ever built to mark the loss, but the river did not need one. Its memory isn't carved in stone, it's embedded in the sediment, in what it buried, and in what it refused to wash away. It doesn't speak, but it never stopped keeping record. By the time most stampeders reached Dawson in the spring of 1898, it was already too late. The richest claims had been staked within weeks of the Bonanza Creek discovery. The riverbeds were spoken for, the pay dirt sectioned off by law and by rumor. But the flood of people kept coming anyway, drawn by headlines, by stories, by letters sent home that left out the cold. They arrived carrying picks, pans, and hopes too heavy for their boots. Many had never seen snow before. Others had spent their last coin just to get passage on a steamer. They came because they'd heard of gold, but they stayed because they had nothing to go back to. The city they found wasn't what the papers promised. Dawson had swelled past its breaking point, a tent city trying to masquerade as a capital. Food was scarce. Streets were thick with mud and waste. Lodging was so tight that men slept in shifts, sharing bunks in 6-hour rotations. Water, drawn from the same river that carried waste and mercury, turned sweet only after it was boiled, and even then sometimes not enough. Then the sickness came. Typhoid, smallpox, measles, influenza. There were no hospitals, only tents and borrowed sheets. A woman who came to nurse the sick wrote that death in Dawson came quietly, like sleep, but colder. Another recorded that the dead were often buried in shallow snowbanks until the ground could be dug, and that by the time the soil thawed, few remembered where they'd been placed. The statistics were grim. Between 1898 and 1904, more than a third of all deaths in the Yukon were caused not by violence, not by the elements, but by infection. No one tells that part in Gold Rush stories. Few grew rich, but many paid dearly. There were stories of men who pawned their last boots for medicine, who traded watches for spoons of broth. A man once worth thousands in Seattle was seen digging ditches for $0.25 a day, sleeves torn, shoes wrapped in rope. His name never appeared in the census. He may have left. He may have been buried beside the river with no stone. Luxury still moved through the town, but it looked strange next to the hunger. In a Dawson saloon, a chandelier hung from a ceiling with frost on the inside. Champagne was served to men coughing blood into kerchiefs. A menu listed pheasant and oysters, but a traveler noted that the real dinner was beans and the oysters were an echo from San Francisco. One hotel kept its piano tuned, though no one played. The keys had warped in the cold. A blanket was folded neatly over the bench. No one touched it, not out of respect, but because they'd heard someone had died there, waiting for news of a claim that never came through. There were no clear lines between failure and survival. Some men found gold and lost themselves in it. Others found nothing and stayed anyway, too ashamed to go home. Some simply disappeared. A leather trunk, found decades later in a crawl space beneath a collapsed miner's cabin, held a pair of child's shoes, a torn letter addressed to no one, and a marriage license with both names crossed out in pencil. No diary, no name on the wall. Just the trunk, just what was never mailed. Some couldn't afford to leave. Some died before they had the chance. And others simply folded into the background, washing dishes for the lucky, tending fires in boarding houses, taking jobs so far removed from the dream they'd come for that the gold became myth even while they still stood beside it. There was no single collapse, no day it all fell apart, only fatigue, silence, and the quiet acceptance that whatever they'd come looking for was not going to save them. Some didn't leave anything behind. Others left too much. In a boarding house attic in Dawson, a box was found decades later, its lid warped and nailed shut with iron tacks. Inside were 6 letters, all unsent, still sealed, still folded, tied together with the same blue ribbon that had once wrapped around a collar or a dress. The paper was heavy, embossed in gold leaf, the kind used for invitations or legal notices. The ink had faded but remained legible. Not one envelope had a stamp, no dates, no addresses, just first names: James, Anna, MC, Mother, and each letter ended the same way, without a signature. Some were written in anger, others read like farewells. One simply listed supplies: 1 pan, 1 stove, your wool scarf is in the trunk. Do not come after me. It wasn't poetry, it was planning, and it had never been sent. Letters like these are scattered across the Yukon, left in trunks beneath collapsed floorboards, tucked into coat linings, burned at the corners by stove ash. They were written on linen stationery, sometimes creased with sweat, sometimes dotted with wax, and often left with the full intention of being mailed later. But later often never came. In 1898, mail service to Dawson was slow and uncertain. Letters took months, if they arrived at all. Some travelers brought correspondence in their boots or sewn into jackets, hoping to hand them off to someone heading south. Others waited until they'd struck gold before sending word, wanting success to arrive first, even if their face came second. Some never struck anything. A letter found inside a lacquered writing case near Bonanza Creek read, "I don't yet know what I'm doing. There's more snow than I thought. The river froze this week. I miss you. I keep seeing your coat in the crowd, but it's never you." The handwriting stopped mid-line. The envelope had been sealed, but it was never carried out. Luxury existed here, but always in conflict. A wax seal, pressed with a family crest, cracked open with a knife meant for cutting salted pork. Gloves with mother-of-pearl buttons laid gently atop a letter that would never leave the room. A hand mirror with initials engraved into the frame, so the writer could see their reflection as they tried to explain themselves to someone who might never read their words. The stories in these letters weren't written for history. They were meant for someone who mattered more than gold, someone who lived far from ice, from mercury rivers and tents that burned. But most of these people never got replies. Some never even sent the message. It wasn't always sorrow that stopped them. Sometimes it was shame. Sometimes it was the cold. Sometimes it was simply the realization that they had nothing good to say and nothing left to prove. When archaeologists opened the trunk, they found the letters beside a folded shawl and a bottle of perfume sealed with wax. The shawl had frayed at the edge. The bottle was still intact. The scent inside was faint, but it was there, just enough to remind you someone waited long enough to say goodbye, and someone else never got to read it. They had always said the Yukon kept its secrets, but sometimes it gives one back. In the summer of 1949, a flood near El Dorado Creek broke open, part of an old embankment, exposing not gold, but the edge of a collapsed shelter. Its beams thawed loose, its contents soaked in melt and time. Inside was a body, and beside it, a pack. No name, no markers. The census had no match, but what remained was specific. Inside the pack, wrapped in waxed cloth, were 3 things. A pocket watch, its lid scratched, the monogram rubbed almost flat. A sapphire stick pin, still bright against the canvas. And a handkerchief, soft and pale, embroidered with the letter M. No diary, no map, no claim number. Just the ordinary effort of someone who had intended to return or to be remembered and didn't. Items like these are rare, not because people didn't bring them, but because they didn't survive the frost. Paper buckles, cloth disintegrates, wood warps. But here, the freeze had preserved the soft things, the satin lining, the edge of silver, the thread in a single embroidered letter. The man was never identified, but the watch had stopped at 4:19. Whether a morning or an evening, no one could say. In the Yukon archives, there's a note from a field officer assigned to document the site, likely a miner caught in spring runoff. Unknown, no relatives traced, artifacts boxed and sealed, no burial requested. That box now sits in storage, not on display, not labeled with anything but a code. But sometimes, artifacts return by other routes. After a fire melted the permafrost under an old storehouse near Bear Creek, several long-lost crates re-emerged, swept into the melt and exposed like fossils. One crate had originally been shipped from Vancouver in 1897, labeled A. LeMay Dawson. It never made it to its recipient. Inside were goods meant for arrival: a pair of brushed wool trousers, a silver shaving kit with ivory inlay, a small, leather-bound photo album, still sealed in tissue, never opened. It wasn't mystery that made it compelling. It was the ordinary fact that someone had packed these things, counted them, and sent them north with a plan. And that plan, like so many others, simply dissolved into snow and silence. Sometimes the ice hides the tragedies. Sometimes it holds them in place. And sometimes, when it shifts just enough, it gives you back a nameless man with a watch, a pin, and a handkerchief for a letter no one ever finished writing. Not everyone struck gold. but not everyone left. By the end of 1899, the Klondike Rush had begun to fade. Word of gold in Nome, Alaska, reached Dawson like a second wind, and thousands packed up overnight. Steamer manifests filled with familiar names, men who once held claims, women who ran saloons, families who had just finished building roofs that no longer leaked. But some didn't go. Some stayed behind, not because they had found what they came for, but because they had nowhere else to go. A woman named Margaret Clark came to Dawson in 1897 with her husband. He vanished within the first year. No body, no note, just a tent emptied one morning, and the fire left cold. She took over a boarding house 2 streets from the river, converted a canvas room into a kitchen, and served hot tea to anyone who brought their own mug. Her ledger survives, penciled in soft, careful columns. Room 3, 6 nights, paid in coin. Room 6, linens burned, payment uncertain. Extra firewood, don't charge the quiet boy. She stayed through the fire, rebuilt, paid off what little debt she could. When her name appears in the 1904 census, she's listed not as widow or landowner, just keeper. The ones who stayed were often not the loudest. They didn't write memoirs, they maintained the floors. After the rush, Dawson became something quieter. The dance halls dimmed. Music still played, but only on Fridays. A bakery stayed open through 2 winters. Its sign painted fresh each year, though no one knew why. The tailor on 6th Street stopped taking new orders, but kept the shop open, if only to sit beside the stove and read. A room above his storefront was found boarded up in 1921. Inside was a chair, a wash basin, a folded suit wrapped in brown paper, and an ivory-handled hairbrush resting on a shelf, still lined with long black strands. No name, no note. The shopkeeper claimed not to know who had lived there, or why the door had never been reopened. Some took jobs with the police, the rail company, the post office. Others became guides or ran soup kitchens from the back of converted stables. They weren't chasing wealth anymore, only steadiness. One man, once a prospector, became a cook for miners working second-hand claims. He worked the same ground he used to own, now under someone else's title. A fur collar from his old expedition coat was sewn onto his apron. He wore it every winter. Was that pride or habit? You can still feel them in the town's bones, the ones who never left. Their buildings are sturdier, their stories shorter. A bar that once held 20 now holds 4. A dress shop turned into a watch repair store. The wallpaper is faded, but still in place. Luxury in Dawson didn't disappear. It just faded gently into background. A glass doorknob that still catches light. A rug so worn the pattern has rubbed to dust. A brass kettle on a shelf that hasn't boiled in decades but still smells faintly of dried cloves when opened. They didn't come for this, but they made something of it anyway. And when asked, many of them gave the same answer. I stayed because I already knew what it was like to leave. The maps came first, before the tents, before the trails, before the frost had a chance to settle. You could buy them in Seattle or Juneau, printed fast on thin paper, folded into guidebooks, sold for 50 cents. They showed everything. Rivers named too early, towns not yet built, claim zones boxed in neat black ink. The trails were marked in dashed lines, clean curves from port to gold. Some even listed resting cabins, warm lodges with stables and stew according to the print. But most of those cabins never existed. Some never even had foundations. One map published in 1897 claimed there was a shortcut to Dawson that cut travel by half. Several hundred men followed it. By November, not one had arrived. The route had been traced by rumor and sold as fact. Rescue parties found splintered sleds, torn boots, journals with pages ripped for kindling. The river had covered the rest. How many men died chasing a line someone inked without walking it? It wasn't just maps. It was memory too. People repeated names like Charms, Bonanza, El Dorado, 40 Mile. Some heard gold had been spotted at Bear Paw Creek, though no one could remember who said it first. One prospector spent a month searching for a claim known only as Eagle's Teeth. He was found years later in a ravine. No eagle, no teeth, no claim. And yet, every journey needed a destination, even the made-up ones. A woman named Ruth LeMay kept a record of where her husband was supposed to be, writing dates and creek names in the margins of a calendar she brought from home. After he vanished, she pinned the pages to the wall of her tent and circled each one in red. She later told a census taker, "If I don't mark the day, it never existed, and I won't let him vanish into something that never happened." Her tent was found fully intact 5 years later, the calendar still hanging, the map folded beside it. Some claim the trails were cursed, that certain markings disappeared overnight. A carved arrow in a tree gone by morning, a pile of stones scattered without animal tracks nearby. But it wasn't superstition, it was wind, weather, and too many hands drawing lines they didn't have to walk. One section of trail near Skagway was marked on a government map as sheltered. In reality, it was a wind tunnel. Temperatures fell below -40 degrees Fahrenheit, and gusts knocked men off balance. A journal entry recovered from a buried cache read, "They say there's warmth ahead, but I've stopped believing strangers." Why did people keep following? Because when the world collapses behind you, job lost, debts mounting, names worn thin by disappointment, sometimes even a bad map feels better than standing still. There's a name for that in history. We call it ambition. But in letters, it looks more like this: "I think I'm close now." There's a man who says he knows a shortcut. "If this doesn't work, I'll come home next winter." What makes a map believable? Ink, paper, the way someone says it with enough certainty? And what happens to those who disappear into a map that never led anywhere at all? There are still sections of Yukon wilderness where the trails fade out, not because they were reclaimed by nature, but because they were never real to begin with. Maybe the gold was never there. Maybe it didn't need to be. When the steamers left Dawson, they didn't take everything with them. As the gold rush slowed and the last wave of stampeders either struck out for Nome or went back home, the town's storage rooms, post offices, and customs stations began to fill with objects that no one returned to collect. Some were crates, stacked neatly, marked in thick black ink. To be held, await claim. Others were more delicate, a gold-ringed collar box never opened, a carpet bag lined with silk, still wrapped in oilcloth, a pearl-handled cane, boxed with 2 shirts, and a small bottle of hair tonic. The names were real, the stories were not. One crate, addressed to Monsieur Holloway, El Dorado District, sat for years behind the back room of the freight office. When opened, it held a pair of shoes wrapped in wool, a small photograph album, and a sealed letter that read, "For when you come back through." But there's no record of M. Holloway ever passing that way again. Some boxes were torn open during the fire, their contents scorched but not destroyed. A monogrammed cufflink was found in the street, pressed into ice like a pressed coin. The initials didn't match anyone listed on the registry that year. The other cufflink was never recovered. There are lists, long, neat ledgers of unclaimed goods, still housed in the Yukon archives. And across many of them, the same phrases repeat. Not taxed. Awaiting reply. Letter sent. No return. Opened by request. Contents deteriorated. Some were simple forgettings. Others felt like decisions. You don't always come back for what you leave behind. Sometimes it's easier not to. One crate, wrapped in tarred canvas, was opened decades later and found to contain nothing but canned peaches and a child's fur hat. The fur had hardened. The label inside had faded. But someone packed it, boxed it, and paid to have it delivered north, and never came back for it. Was it grief, pride, or just distance? The kind that stretches over years until returning no longer makes sense? Not all losses are dramatic. Some happen in storage, quiet, deliberate, deferred. And still, the things remain. A spoon polished from movement, a receipt signed but never collected, a silk handkerchief folded with care and stored in a pocket no longer attached to a coat. What we claim says who we are, but what we don't, that's where the real story lingers. If you've been following the trail with us, the gold, the ash, the ledges, the fire, the things that were left behind, leave a comment with the one detail you'd never forget, and subscribe if you want the next chapter to find you before the trail goes cold. The Klondike didn't just collect gold, it collected aliases. By the summer of 1898, the Dawson Registry listed over 20,000 names, but not all of them belonged to the people who wrote them. Some were misheard, some were shortened, many were chosen. A new name gave you a second chance. Sometimes that was the whole point of heading north. A man called Thomas Vane filed 5 claims in 2 weeks. each under a different spelling of his last name: Vane, Vane, Vanes, Van. When his original claim was challenged in court, the judge couldn't determine which version was legal. None of them matched the name on his ship manifest from San Francisco. There's a town ledger that lists a William Grace signing in as a guest at the White House Hotel. The same day, a land transfer document appears with the name Henry Gray. Same signature style, same handwriting. The handwriting analyst called it suspicious. The townspeople just called it survival. People didn't always lie to steal. Sometimes they lied to stay. A woman arrived from Seattle and introduced herself as Miss Coralie Ash, claiming to be a singer from Vancouver. She rented a room above a bakery and paid in gold flakes, never revealing where she worked or who paid her. 5 years later, the same name appeared in a shipping log for a return vessel to Portland, but now listed as Mrs. L. Henderson. No one ever confirmed if it was the same woman. The boarding house log still lists her room as occupied, crossed out only in 1902. Sometimes the lies were small: a hometown changed, a profession upgraded, a middle name erased. Sometimes they were entire lives rebuilt from ash. A tailor's jacket was found in a burned-out cabin with a label that read, "Property of C.H. Lafitte, New Orleans." But Lafitte never came to the Yukon. His name appears nowhere in customs records, mining claims, or ship manifests. The cabin was registered to a different man. The coat may have been stolen, or borrowed, or inherited, or maybe Lafitte was there, just not under that name. The census takers did their best, but the books were full of contradictions. 2 Johns in the same bunkhouse, a woman listed twice under maiden and married names, men claiming to be brothers with no shared birthplace. Some errors were clerical, others were intentional. The difference didn't always matter, but the consequences did. One man's land was confiscated after his name was found to match another's debt. Whether it was a coincidence or a borrowed identity, he lost the claim. His journal entry read, "I don't mind losing the gold, but I do mind losing my name." The truth is, names were currency here. You could spend them, trade them, even bury them if needed. And once you wrote something down, in a ledger, on a claim, on the wall of a bunkhouse, that version often became the only one history kept. So what do we do with these names? The ones that don't match, the ones that vanish in mid-sentence, the ones found engraved on rings recovered from fire with initials no one can trace. Maybe the more honest question isn't who they were, but who they wanted to be. Most stories don't get lost in the telling, they get lost in the sending. During the height of the Klondike Rush, mail delivery in the Yukon was erratic at best. A letter sent from Dawson to Seattle could take 6 months. If the weather cooperated, if the postmaster had a horse, if the river ice broke early, if no one dropped the sack into snow or water or fire. And for many, those were too many ifs to carry a memory safely home. Which is why so many letters didn't make it. They weren't all unsent. Some were mailed, but they didn't arrive in time to matter. One trunk discovered in an abandoned cabin near Stewart Crossing contained 24 opened envelopes, all addressed to the same name, E. Derlin. Most had been forwarded, remarked, rerouted. Each envelope bore 3 or 4 stamps, scribbled handwriting, postmarks from Vancouver, Juneau, Fort Selkirk. The last one, never opened, simply read, "Return to sender. No longer at camp. There was no camp left to find." Many of the messages were written on pressed linen stationery, the kind that left a crease when folded and smelled faintly of smoke or perfume when warmed by hand. Some were sealed with wax, not because it was required, but because sealing a letter properly made it feel more like a vow. And then the snow came, and the distance grew, and some messages became too hard to write or too late to send. A prospector named Harold Vexley is known from only 2 records, a mining claim filed near Bonanza Creek and a letter recovered from a collapsed postal station dated December 2nd, 1898. The letter was addressed to his brother and written in a confident hand. It began, "I think I've finally found the right line. The frost is worse than I planned for, but I believe this ground has something under it." The letter ends mid-page. Some say he froze before finishing. Others say the letter was meant to be a draft, but the ink runs slightly, as if something warm had melted across the paper. Snow, perhaps, or a cup of tea knocked from the table in surprise. He was never seen again. Postal stations during the rush were underfunded and overwhelmed. In some towns, the postmaster was the only literate man. In others, mail was dumped in piles and residents sorted it themselves. Theft wasn't uncommon. Letters were opened, read aloud, even posted on saloon doors as entertainment. One letter from a woman named Eloise, found unopened in a storage crate behind a Dawson trading post, read in full, "You do not have to send anything back. Just tell me that you're warm." It was never sealed. What was it like to wait for a reply, to believe it was coming, day after day, and eventually forget what you even wrote? What happens to a memory that never leaves the page? Luxury crept in even here. A silver pen nib etched with initials was found in a collapsed hut near the Klondike River. The nib was attached to a carved handle, ivory, with a gold band at the base. The nib had snapped in 2, whether by accident or anger, no one could say. The ground doesn't judge the message, it only keeps what isn't claimed. And across the Yukon, between the roots of birch trees and beneath floorboards never repaired, the stories that didn't reach their destination are still waiting, written in careful cursive, pressed in folds, wrapped in silk or burlap, sealed or left open, but always unfinished. When the gold thinned out, the noise left with it. By the early 1900s, Dawson City had already begun to shrink. The newspapers reported it as transition, but the buildings said otherwise. Storefronts stayed boarded, curtains still hung in upstairs windows. One saloon still had a coat on a hook by the door, never claimed, never removed. Some buildings weren't demolished, they were just left. A bakery closed in 1901. The last receipt is still tacked above the register. 1 loaf, 2 eggs, no name written. The shelves are empty now, but the floor creaks as if it still remembers weight. A marble wash basin sits under the counter, stained where water once dried. There's no drama in abandonment, just accumulation. One boarding house kept its wallpaper, not by choice. It was too expensive to remove. The pattern, once pale blue, is now mottled green from mold. On the second floor, a settee still upholstered in faded linen slouches toward the floorboards. Its legs are intact. No one ever took it. A piano sits in the corner of a burned-out hall. It hasn't been touched in decades. Someone once played there, maybe often. The keys are stained but whole. The bench remains pulled out, as if someone only stepped away for a minute. But the fire blackened the ceiling above it, and the walls around it are warped. No one cleaned up. No one packed it out. They left the music where it was. The Yukon doesn't erase, it just covers. Some of the silence was practical. People left because work ran dry. Claims were bought out. Others moved on to Alaska. But some left without announcement. Doors closed behind them. Lamps left on tables. Boots still beneath the bed. A general store near Front Street kept its records in a leather ledger, embossed and stitched. The last page reads, "Inventory logged, awaiting return." There's no return recorded. The ink stops there. And upstairs, in the back room, a small perfume bottle with a crystal stopper still sits on a shelf. The scent is almost gone, but if you warm the glass in your hands, you can still catch something sweet. The last official claim filed in Dawson wasn't for gold. It was for the lot behind the livery stable, a patch of frozen ground that had been used to store broken sleds and discarded barrels. The paperwork was neat, signed, stamped, complete, but no one ever built on the land. The applicant, a man named Samuel Norrin, left no other record, no census entry, no business listing, no tax filing, just a name, a signature, and a parcel number assigned to a place that had already begun to sink back into the riverbank. Sometimes, you wonder why someone would go through the trouble. Maybe it was hope. Maybe it was ritual. The folder containing Norrin's claim was stored in a cabinet lined in red felt, beside a velvet ledger with brass corner caps. The drawer hadn't been opened in decades. When it finally was, the papers inside had grown stiff, the ink dulled to the color of river mud, but the lines were still legible. On the inside flap, in unfamiliar handwriting, someone had written, "No development. File anyway." There's no indication of what was meant to be done with the land. No cabin ever stood there. No structure was listed for taxation. But on a cold day in 1910, a local surveyor found a sealed envelope in the snow near that same plot. It had been tied with twine, the paper gone soft from moisture. Inside was a single page, folded once. It read, keep it quiet. I never wanted the gold. There was no name, no date, just that one line. The envelope was stored with the rest of Norin's file. It's still there, unopened since. Whether it belonged to him or was dropped by someone else passing through, no one can say. A cane with a gold cap was later recovered in the same area, half buried near a thawed stump. The initials on the cap didn't match the claim. There were no footprints nearby when it was found. It had been there for years. Some people left with what they found, others with what they learned, and a few, a quiet few, left with nothing visible at all. After the people left, the quiet didn't come all at once. It moved in slowly, first replacing music with footsteps, then footsteps with wind, and eventually even that gave way to the sound of melting snow, dripping from roofs no one repaired. In the northern quarter of Dawson, where most of the homes were built by those who didn't strike rich, but stayed anyway, the silence settled in layers. Window panes fogged from the inside, floorboards curled inward. In one house, a curtain remained drawn over a parlor window, stitched in blue thread, still looped neatly around the tie. No one ever pulled it open again. Down the road, a storefront door no longer swung, but hung crooked in its frame. The glass in the upper pane had cracked and frozen, not shattered, just fractured like a map without labels. A silver-plated lamp, bolted to the floor in a hotel lobby, still stood there when the building collapsed. It was recovered intact, burnished by frost, its base stained with wax and rust. No one ever came back for it. These weren't ruins, not really. They were preserved gestures, the last position of a chair, the way a spoon was left beside a cold basin, the final place someone placed their hands before walking out. And the quiet that followed wasn't empty. It held what wasn't said, the letter never sent, the conversation unfinished, the decision not to explain why they were leaving. In the long freeze, nothing moved, but nothing eroded either. A pair of work gloves hung from a nail by the door in one boarding house. They'd stiffened over time, but still held the curve of a wrist. A teacup, faintly patterned in gold leaf, remained upside down on a counter beside a tin of matches. Both were clean. Someone had prepared to leave, but not in a hurry. Sometimes the most honest part of a place is what people didn't rush to take. The silence didn't erase the gold rush. It recorded it differently, not in headlines or statistics, but in a pillow left indented, a coat hung and never retrieved, a bell mounted above a chapel door that never rang again. Some places forget in fire. The Yukon forgets in frost. When the last gold claims were filed and the town began to thin, people believed the land would erase what was left, that snow and time would wash it all into the river. But the ground didn't clear things away. It simply closed over them, and then it held them. Each spring, with the permafrost shifting upward in fragile wet collapse, fragments surface. Not loudly, not in piles. One object at a time, bent slightly, dirt-lined, still waiting. In 1994, a survey team near Hunker Creek discovered a trench once used for placer mining. Half of it had frozen and cracked, exposing a split stovepipe, a rusted tin, and something softer, a beaded slipper, flattened from pressure, but still glinting at the toe. The pattern, floral, stitched in crimson, white and blue, hadn't dulled. Its pair was never found. Who brought something like that here? Who packed it next to picks and rope and oilskin? It wasn't made for warmth. It was made for remembering who you were before you crossed into a place that asked you to forget. A few miles south, a frozen crate was pulled from a melt pocket after a series of unusually warm seasons. Inside, cushioned in old pine needles, was a velvet drawstring pouch, soft at the seams, but intact. Inside the pouch, a pair of gold cufflinks, still joined, still polished. There was no monogram, no ledger entry, but the box had been packed with care. Why hadn't anyone opened it? Was it forgotten, or was it never meant to be recovered? Along the banks of the Stewart River, researchers cataloging shoreline thaw in 2011 found a comb made of ivory, wrapped in a strip of linen printed with the French manufacturer's stamp. The cloth had browned, but the stamp remained legible. The comb was missing 3 teeth, but the initials AV were still etched into the spine. These weren't objects abandoned in panic. They were sealed into place by routine. At an old sod house site, a brocade sleeve was discovered, preserved beneath roof timber collapse. The fabric curled and fragile, the button still stitched at the wrist. Traces of starch remained in the fold. It hadn't been torn. It had simply been left in place and covered slowly, over time. Inside the ruin of a hillside pantry, carved into soil and lined with wood, a porcelain bowl held a spoon inside it, angled as if recently used. A tin of flour had solidified into chalk. A slip of blue ribbon was pinned to a board above the shelf, its end pressed with a wax seal, now cracked. The imprint was no longer readable. Not everything was valuable, but most of it had been meant for someone, and some things were never finished. Beneath the floor of a schoolhouse, workers unearthed a sealed envelope wrapped in waxed paper. It had no stamp, but was addressed, written in careful hand, still deciding where to go. There was nothing inside. In the Yukon archives, there's a note from a 20th century preservationist that reads, "These finds are slow. Nothing appears in full. Everything is fragment. But fragments are the most honest form of memory. They don't exaggerate. They don't summarize. They simply wait. And the ground, for all its silence, has been waiting too. Long after the tents rotted, long after the claims lapsed, long after the rush burned itself out, the permafrost kept what people stopped remembering. A ribbon, a cufflink, a half letter, a name still etched on the spine of a comb. It didn't start with shouting, it started with smoke. By 1912, Dawson City had already gone quiet. The crowds were thinner, the saloons darker, the hotels mostly empty except for workers and winter holdovers. No one talked about gold much anymore. The ones who stayed had come to understand that the thing worth saving was not the rush, but what was left after it. That winter, a fire started in a dry goods warehouse along King Street. Some say it was an accident. A lamp tipped over. A stove door left ajar. Others said it was set deliberately, not out of violence, but to make space. For what? No one ever explained. The fire didn't sweep through like the blaze of '99. It moved slower, hung lower, but it was hungrier in a different way. By morning, 2 city blocks were gone. Not leveled, emptied. Walls stood without roofs. Staircases led nowhere. One building held its shape, but not its purpose. A ledger found inside had fire damage along the spine, but the entries were still legible. The last line read, "Inventory pending, decision postponed." The paper around it had browned like dried leaves. Fire changes records, not just by burning them, but by forcing decisions you've put off for too long. What to keep, what to rebuild, what to finally let go. On the edge of the burned district, someone found a crystal doorknob, still attached to its wood frame, fused into place. The wood had curled backward. The knob glinted. It hadn't cracked. Inside the remains of a jewelry store, a melted brooch was pulled from the ashes, gold around the edges, but the clasp was gone. It had been kept in a display case, probably never sold, probably never meant to be. The shop had closed a year earlier, but the windows had stayed unboarded, as if someone was still planning to return. They never did. No deaths were recorded. No criminal investigation followed. Most people didn't even write it down. For a town that had once announced every thunderclap, this fire ended in a kind of collective exhale. Maybe they were tired of salvaging. Maybe they knew the fire did what they couldn't. Afterward, some buildings were patched. Most weren't. One of the burned lots became a garden. Another was cleared and left as bare dirt. Tourists were told it had always looked that way. But memory is not always held in what survives. Sometimes it's sealed in what no longer needs explanation. And in the center of a town that once measured time by lantern light and gold dust, the ashes were not a tragedy, they were a decision. At the time, no one thought much of the handkerchief. It was plain cotton, edged with blue stitching, folded twice, kept in the pocket of a man who ran errands for the hotel. It wasn't embroidered, it wasn't scented, it wasn't silk. But when they found his things after the fire, scattered in a metal locker behind the stables, the handkerchief was the only item folded. His name didn't survive on any monument, but his care did. That's the strange thing about endings. It's never the gold that lingers. It's the button that didn't match, the penknife rubbed smooth by use, the notebook with grocery figures and a child's name in the corner, circled but never explained. These weren't objects people saved. They were objects that survived because no one thought they were worth taking. In the Dawson archives, There's a cloth-bound journal with only 2 pages written. The first is a list of debts. The second just says, "Pack lighter next time." The irony is, it was the only thing the man left behind. His tent burned, his tools were sold, but the journal remained, untouched in a crate for 80 years. A store near the river was stripped clean during the decline, but in the back room, behind a warped panel, they found a single shelf still stacked with spoons, tin, cheap, unpolished. Not the kind anyone would steal, not the kind you'd ever see in a photo, but they were all stacked the same way, handles aligned, bowls turned left, just enough space between each for a hand to slip in and grab one without noise. Someone once cared about the quiet. In a corner of the church, under a bench that hadn't been moved since the rush, they found a child's slate, still faint with chalk. A drawing of a boot, a stick figure, a square that might have been a house. The date beside it was smudged. The name had worn off, but you can still see where the chalk pressed harder in the last stroke, like someone wanted it to stay. These were never the things the rush was about. They weren't measured, they weren't counted, they weren't even noticed, until there was nothing left to notice but them. And by then, they mattered more than any nugget. By the time the last freight pulled away from Dawson, winter had already begun to edge in from the river, not with urgency, but with that slow, quiet certainty that comes when even the wind seems to move with less interest than before. The Yukon didn't make a sound when it froze. It didn't crack or roar or announce anything at all. The current simply slowed beneath a thickening skin of ice until the last of the water was no longer moving, and the silence that followed didn't feel new. It felt like something that had been waiting. There were no more boats, no voices calling out dockside, no crates sliding across planks, just the sound of frost lifting wood grain from old porch steps and the faint creak of rafters in buildings that hadn't been warmed in weeks. Where once the town had measured time by bells and ship horns and shovels, there was now only stillness, a kind that wrapped itself around everything, until even the sound of footsteps disappeared before they could echo. The buildings didn't fall right away. Most of them just stood in place, windows fogged from the inside out, doors slightly ajar, curtains still drawn across rooms that hadn't been opened in seasons. No one boarded them shut. No one returned to clean them out. They were left as they were, with boot prints in the snow, fading by morning, and stove ash still sitting cold in the trays. Along the shoreline, where freight once piled high, the ice pushed up against broken posts and swallowed what had been left behind. Fragments of bottled glass, a bent rail spike, the corner of a crate that had never been claimed. And once, not far from the old ferry landing, a silver thimble surfaced, still smooth, still whole, caught in a shallow melt before vanishing again. It's easy to think of this as abandonment, a loss or retreat. But it wasn't grief that followed the end of the rush. It was something else, quieter than regret, slower than memory, a return to scale. Nature didn't erase Dawson. It didn't reclaim it with vines or collapse it in a storm. It simply waited long enough for the weight of the buildings to settle into the ground. There were no ceremonies, no final headlines, no map with a red X to mark the moment the town ceased to matter. It didn't end. It just finished speaking. In a bend of the river, not far from where the first claims were staked, one post still stands upright, its top cut flat, its sides blackened from an old fire, its grain split wide by cycles of thaw and freeze. There is no marker nearby, no initials carved, no name. No one remembers who drove it in, but the earth didn't push it over, and the river never stopped flowing around it. If you walk that way in spring, when the melt begins to shift under the ice and the light catches low along the banks, you might hear something, not loud, not clear, just a kind of breath moving beneath the surface. And if you listen closely enough, you'll realize the story didn't vanish. It just grew quiet. No one wrote a final entry. The Yukon Gold Rush, for all its thunder and fever, for all the steamers and songs and claims and ceremonies, didn't end with the sentence. It ended like the stories it left behind, not fully recorded, not properly archived, and not quite erased either. The ledgers remain in fragments, some with water damage, others with missing pages, some written in pencil that faded before it could dry. There are entries that begin with names and trail off before they reach destinations. Land parcels that were claimed but never walked. Journals that were started in hope, then folded and packed away in silence. You won't find the gold, not really. You'll find traces of preparation, evidence of expectation, and silence where a life used to be. A stove left full of ash, a mirror cracked in transit but still hung on the wall, a coat folded over the back of a chair like someone had just stepped outside to check the weather. These are the things that survived longer than the ones who placed them. The gold rush was always measured in weight, ounces, pounds, tons. But what lingered wasn't weight, it was shape. The shape of a glove curled from age. The shape of a spoon placed beside a cup that was never filled. The shape of a house that stood longer than the memory of who built it. The ledger was never finished because it was never meant to be. The men and women who came north didn't imagine they'd leave stories untold. But the frost doesn't take permission. The river doesn't file paperwork. The wind doesn't ask if you meant to come back and finish what you started. And maybe that's how all history closes. Not with a conclusion, but with a drawer still half open. A final page left blank. If you found this story lingering in your thoughts, there's another waiting. In the next episode, we go further west. But it's not gold they're chasing, it's survival. The next video is the forgotten horror of the Donner Party, where it tells the truth behind one of America's most mythologized tragedies. Not just what they endured in the mountains, but what they left behind in the snow. If this video stayed with you, like it so others can find it too. If a single object or moment stood out, tell me in the comments. I read every one, and if you want to hear the next story before the frost closes in again, subscribe so the next ledger finds you first.